Welcome to another IB Environmental Systems and Societies video. Today we're going to cover the higher level content for topic 2.5, Zonation, Succession, and Change in Ecosystems. The HL content builds on what you've already learned about succession at the standard level, but now we're going to go deeper into the factors that control how succession happens, how productivity changes during succession, and some really interesting debates about what natural ecosystems would actually look like without human interference. So let's get into it. Let's start with content statement 2.5.9. This statement tells us that the type of community that develops in a succession is influenced by many different factors. The slide lists climatic factors, properties of the local bedrock and soil, geomorphology, which just means the shape and the features of the land, and then fire and weather related events as well. The statement also mentions something called top-down influences from primary consumers or higher trophic levels. That's a fancy way of saying that animals eating plants can actually influence which plants grow in an area. So why does this matter? Well, it means that succession isn't just a simple, predictable process. Two areas starting with bare rock might end up as completely different ecosystems depending on these factors. One might become a grassland while another becomes a forest, even though they both started the exact same way. We're going to focus first on soils because it's probably the most important factor during succession. The slide lists 5 key soil properties that influence communities. Soil depth limits root penetration. If you only have 10 centimeters of soil, you can't really grow trees with meter-long roots. You're limited to shallow-rooted plants like grasses. Nutrient availability determines plant growth. Plants need nitrogen, phosphorus, and some other nutrients to grow. Poor soils mean stunted, slow-growing plants. Rich soils means lush vegetation. pH in soils influences which nutrients are available to plants. So you might have plenty of iron in your soil, but if the pH is wrong, plants can't absorb that iron. It's like having food in a locked cabinet. It's there, but you can't use it. Soil texture determines water retention and drainage, and that affects oxygen levels underground. Sandy soils drain quickly, so roots have plenty of air, but plants might not get enough water. Clay soils hold a lot of water, but they can become waterlogged, and that suffocates the roots because they don't have any air. And finally, organic matter supports soil organisms. Dead leaves, decomposing plants, and animal waste create a layer of organic matter that feed bacteria, fungi, earthworms, and countless other organisms that make the soil healthy. Now look at that diagram at the bottom of the slide. Notice how it shows succession from stage 1 through stage 7, from bare rock to a mature forest. As the soil gets deeper, the plant community becomes more complex. Early stages have just lichens and mosses growing on rock. The middle stages support grasses and flowers, and then late stages can finally support large trees. The soil depth is literally controlling which plants can survive there. But soil isn't the only factor. Climate limits which communities can develop in the first place. You're not going to get a tropical rainforest in Antarctica no matter how good your soil is. The temperature and the precipitation set the boundaries for what's possible. Bedrock properties affect soil formation and soil properties. Some types of bedrock, like limestone, weather into nutrient-rich alkaline soils, and other types, like granite, create more acidic soil with fewer nutrients. Steep slopes also limit soil development. Look at this picture from the DRC. You see those eroded slopes? On steep terrain, gravity pulls soil and water downhill before those things can accumulate. This is called erosion, and it prevents deep, stable soils from forming. Poor drainage can also cause waterlogging. If water can't drain away, the soil becomes saturated. This creates low oxygen conditions that most plants can't tolerate. Only specialized plants that are adapted to wet conditions, like mangroves or cattails, can survive. Routine fires also shape community composition. Some ecosystems experience regular fires, and over time, only fire-resistant species survive. Plants that can't handle fire get eliminated from the community. And finally, herbivores can influence vegetation patterns. When large numbers of deer, elephants, or other plant eaters graze an area, they prevent certain species from dominating. We're going to return to this idea a little bit later on when we discuss the Vera hypothesis about European ecosystems. Here's a specific example of how fire shapes communities. This photo shows a ponderosa pine forest in the western United States during a controlled burn. Notice that the fire is burning on the ground, but the large trees are surviving. Ponderosa pine forests naturally experience frequent, low-intensity fires every 5 to 15 years. These fires burn away small trees, shrubs, and accumulated dead material on the forest floor. The large ponderosa pines have thick bark that protects them from those fires. Over thousands of years, this fire regime has selected for trees and other plants that can tolerate regular burning. Species that can't handle the fire simply don't survive in that ecosystem. When humans suppress fires for decades, the forest fills with small trees and bushes. And then, when a fire finally does occur, there's so much fuel that it burns extremely hot and it can kill even the large fire-resistant trees. This means that routine fires actually maintain the health of this community. Patterns of both net productivity and gross productivity change over time in a community undergoing succession. You'll remember that gross productivity, or GP, is the total rate of photosynthesis in an ecosystem. Net productivity, or NP, is what's left after you subtract respiration. It represents the actual rate of biomass accumulation. So the equation is NP equals GP minus R, where R is respiration. This is telling us that as succession proceeds, both gross productivity and net productivity change, but they change in different ways. So let's see how. During early succession, we see high net productivity. Look at that complex diagram on your slide showing the stages of succession over time. The green box highlights the early stages. Why is net productivity high in early succession? Well, gross productivity is actually pretty low because conditions are harsh. There's not much soil, there's limited nutrients, and there's lots of exposure to wind and sun. There just aren't many plants yet, and so the total amount of photosynthesis is pretty low. But net productivity is high because biomass is rapidly accumulating. Think about it. You're starting with bare rock, then lichens colonize, then mosses appear, and then grasses, and each stage is adding new biomass that wasn't there before. The ecosystem is growing pretty quickly. Also, there are very few consumers in early succession because without many herbivores, very little of the plant material is being eaten and respired. So most of what the plants produce through photosynthesis stays in the ecosystem and ends up accumulating as biomass. So you have low respiration losses, which means more of the gross productivity ends up as net productivity. In late succession, productivity approaches equilibrium. The blue box on the diagram shows the later stages, especially stage 6, the climax forest. Now, gross productivity increases substantially because you have many more producers. A mature forest has trees filling the canopy, it has shrubs in the understory, and it has herbaceous plants all along the forest floor. And all of these plants are photosynthesizing, so the total gross productivity is much higher than it was in early succession. But here's the interesting part. Net productivity approaches zero in this climax community. And that seems strange until you think about what it actually means. Zero net productivity doesn't mean nothing's happening. It means that added biomass is balanced by loss from death and consumers. In a mature forest, yes, trees are growing and adding new wood, but other trees are dying and falling and decomposing. Leaves are dropping and they're also decomposing. Herbivores are eating plants. Carnivores are eating herbivores. Decomposers are breaking down all the dead material. When you add it all up, the total respiration in the ecosystem balances the gross productivity. The ecosystem isn't getting bigger anymore. It's reached a steady state. That's the equilibrium. The ecosystem is mature and it's stable, with inputs that roughly match outputs. There are two main types of reproductive strategies in ecosystems: R strategists and K strategists. R strategists and K strategists have reproductive strategies that are better adapted to pioneer and climax communities, respectively. These terms come from mathematical ecology. The R represents the growth rate of a population, while K represents the carrying capacity. But you don't need to worry about the math, just focus on understanding the different strategies. R strategists dominate pioneer communities. Look at that diagram showing succession from pioneer species through intermediate species to climax community. The red box highlights the pioneer stage where R strategists thrive. What characterizes R strategists? Generally, they quickly produce many offspring. A single dandelion plant can produce hundreds of seeds. A bacterium can divide into 2 cells every 20 minutes, and then into 4 and 8 and 16 and 32 and so on and so forth. They don't invest much energy or time in each individual offspring, but the R strategists make lots of them. They have short lifespans. Most R strategist plants are annuals that live for just one growing season. They germinate, they grow, they reproduce, and they die all within just a few months. They're capable of rapid colonization. When a disturbance creates bare ground, maybe it's a landslide, a fire, or a plowed field, R strategists are the first ones to arrive. Their lightweight seeds travel on the wind and they quickly germinate. They exploit temporary resources effectively in unstable environments. In pioneer communities, there's lots of sunlight because there's no tall plants casting shade. Our strategists grow fast and they photosynthesize rapidly to take advantage of this abundant sunlight before other species arrive and start competing with it. Think about the weeds in a garden. Most of them are our strategists. They appear quickly, they grow fast, and they produce lots of seeds before you can pull them out. That's the R strategy in action. K strategists dominate climax communities. The red box now highlights stage 6, the mature oak and hickory forest. K strategists have few offspring with high parental investment in each. An oak tree might produce a few hundred acorns in a year, but that's nothing compared to the thousands or even millions of seeds that a pioneer plant produces. However, each acorn is packed with stored energy to help the seedlings survive. Some animals, like elephants, have just one baby every few years and they care for it intensively. They have long lifespans. Oak trees can live for 300 years or more. K strategists are in it for the long haul. They're competitive, niche specialists. In a mature, crowded forest, success doesn't come from growing fast. It comes from being better than your competitors at using the limited resources you have access to. Maybe you're better at growing in shade. Maybe your roots go deeper to access water. Or maybe you can survive with less nitrogen. K strategists have specialized traits that make them excellent competitors in stable environments. They thrive in stable environments. Climax communities don't change much from year to year. K strategists are adapted to these predictable conditions where the same competitive advantages work generation after generation. So you can see how these strategies match different stages of succession. Early succession favors the fast and the prolific. That's the R strategist. Late succession favors the specialized and the long-lived. Those are your K strategists. Now we're moving into some really fascinating content. The ESS syllabus claims that the concept of a climax community has been challenged, and there's uncertainty over what ecosystems would develop naturally if there were no human influences. That might surprise you because so far in this course we've talked about climax communities as if they're these well-defined endpoints of succession. But recent ecological research has questioned whether that's actually true. So let's explore it. This slide shows two contrasting views about European ecosystems. It's called the Vera wood pasture hypothesis, and it's named after the Dutch ecologist Franz Vera, who proposed it in the year 2000. The traditional view on the left says that closed canopy forest is the natural climax community in Europe. And according to this view, Europe would naturally be covered by dense woodland. Trees would dominate without human intervention. Shade-tolerant species would eventually win the competition and form a continuous forest canopy. Grazing animals would prevent this natural state from occurring, and agriculture created the open landscapes we see in Europe today. So in this view, those pastoral scenes with meadows and scattered trees are entirely human-created, artificial landscapes. But Vera proposed an alternative hypothesis that you see on the right side of the slide. He argued that large herbivores shaped prehistoric Europe naturally. Animals like aurochs, those are the wild ancestors of domestic cattle, along with wild horses and European bison, all grazed and browsed naturally across the landscape. This grazing created a mosaic of woodland patches rather than continuous forest. You'd have some open grasslands that are interspersed with trees, creating a park-like landscape. Vera argued that this was the natural state before humans arrived, not a human creation. The dense forests are what's artificial, because they only appeared after humans hunted the large herbivores to extinction. It's a fundamental disagreement about what's natural. It has huge implications for conservation. Should we be trying to restore dense forests, or should we be introducing large herbivores to recreate that park-like landscape? What evidence supports Vera's hypothesis? Here we have several key mechanisms and supporting evidence. The mechanisms are that large herbivores prevent tree regeneration by eating young saplings. Grazing maintains open grassland areas because the herbivores keep eating any trees that try to grow. The trees can only survive in thorny scrub where the sharp thorns protect young trees from being eaten. Herbivores avoid plants like hawthorn and blackthorn. Browsing creates varied habitat structure with a mix of open and closed areas. The natural disturbance from the herbivores themselves is what drives landscape dynamics. They knock down branches, they create trails, they trample areas, and they fertilize the ground with their dung. And importantly, multiple stable states are possible. You could have forest or you could have wood pasture, depending on whether large herbivores are present or not. Neither is more natural than the other. They're just different stable states. What's the evidence? Pollen records from lake sediments show mixed landscapes in prehistoric Europe, not continuous forest. Large herbivore fossils are widely distributed all across the European continent, and that shows that these animals were common before people started hunting them. Modern rewilding projects where large herbivores are reintroduced show these exact patterns developing. The animals create that mosaic-style landscape. Thorny shrubs really do protect tree saplings. If you look at rewilding sites, young trees grow up inside blackthorn thickets where the herbivores can't reach them. Grazing creates biodiversity hotspots because different species thrive in different parts of the mosaic, and historical paintings from the Renaissance and later periods often show open woodlands and parklands, not dense forests. Of course, this is an ongoing scientific debate, as you see on the right side of the slide. Some ecologists dispute the evidence, and they argue that Vera cherry-picked his data that supports his hypothesis. Regional variation is likely more important than one universal pattern. What's true for lowland Central Europe might not be true for mountainous or northern regions. Climate also determines vegetation type regardless of herbivores. You're not going to get the same vegetation in wet Ireland as you would in dry Spain, even with the same herbivore pressures. Human influence has been significant historically for thousands and thousands of years in Europe, and that makes it extremely difficult to know what's truly natural versus what was already modified by early human activity. Most ecologists think the truth likely lies somewhere between the extremes, probably neither continuous dense forest nor completely open parkland, but something in between. The implications for conservation management on the left are significant. This hypothesis questions the need for livestock removal from conservation areas. Maybe large herbivores naturally maintain diversity and we should be including them in our protected areas rather than removing them. Wood pasture might be a more authentic baseline for restoration than dense forest. Rewilding projects should perhaps include grazing animals like cattle and horses as proxies for extinct aurochs and wild horses. This challenges the single climax community concept. Maybe there isn't one correct endpoint for succession, and it suggests that alternative stable states are legitimate. An oak parkland with grazing animals might be just as natural as a dense oak forest. From an environmental ethics perspective, that raises some pretty fascinating questions. What do we mean by natural? Is nature what exists without any human influence, or is nature what existed before industrial civilization? These different definitions lead to very different conservation goals. Let's move on to the final bit of HL content for topic 2.5. Human activity can divert and change the progression of succession, and that leads to something called a plagioclimax. The yellow box defines plagioclimax. It's a community that hasn't been allowed to develop to its natural climax. It's been managed by humans, but it's still a viable habitat in its own right. This is really important to understand. A plagioclimax isn't degraded or damaged. It's a stable, functioning community that just isn't the climax community that would develop without human interference. Many ecosystems we think of as natural are actually plagioclimax communities. Let's look at a specific example of a plagioclimax community, the heather moorlands of the United Kingdom. These beautiful purple landscapes are actually plagioclimax communities. The pink box shows the natural conditions in these areas. They have impervious rocks that don't let water drain through, and that creates acidic soils. They have low nutrient levels, strong winds, and low temperatures, all of which limit plant growth. High annual precipitation, which is generally over about 1,250 millimeters, keeps these areas wet year-round. Cloud cover restricts sunlight, and that reduces photosynthesis. All of these factors lead to low productivity and low species diversity. These are generally pretty harsh conditions. But here's the key question. If humans stopped managing these areas, would they stay as heather moorland? And the answer is probably not. Over time, succession would likely proceed towards scrubland and eventually some kind of woodland. The heather moorland is maintained by human activity. Now we see how human management maintains the heather dominance. Burning prevents woody tissue from accumulating. Heather's a shrub, and if left alone, it becomes old, it becomes woody, and it produces less nutritious growth. Fire kills this old growth and it creates fresh, edible green shoots. That burning happens in 12 to 15-year cycles. Land managers divide the moorland into sections and burn different sections in different years, creating a mosaic of different aged heather. Small, controlled burns prevent uncontrolled fires. By regularly removing the accumulated dead material, managers reduce the risk of catastrophic fires that could damage the ecosystem. Grazing by sheep and sometimes cattle controls the growth rate of the heather. The animals eat the young shoots, and that prevents the heather from growing too tall and too woody. Together, burning and grazing prevent succession to woodland climax. Without these human interventions, the shrubs like gorse would invade, and they would be followed eventually by trees like birch and oak. Now you might ask, if it's artificial, why maintain it? Well, these moorlands support unique species like red grouse, curlews, and golden plovers that depend on that kind of habitat. They have enormous cultural value in British and Scottish identity. They provide economic benefits through sheep farming and grouse shooting, and many people find them beautiful. From an environmental law perspective, these moorlands are often protected by law precisely because they're recognized as valuable habitats, even though they're not the natural climax. From an environmental economics perspective, they provide ecosystem services like water catchment and carbon storage, and that gives them economic value. From an environmental ethics perspective, you have to ask, is it ethical to maintain artificial ecosystems, or should we allow natural succession to occur? There's no simple answer. It depends on what we value. So let's review what we've covered today. We've seen that succession is influenced by many factors: soil, climate, bedrock, geomorphology, disturbance, and even consumers. Productivity patterns change from high net productivity in early succession to equilibrium at climax. Different reproductive strategies dominate at different stages, with R strategists in pioneer communities and K strategists dominating climax communities. The concept of a climax community is more complex and more debatable than we once thought, and that's shown by the Vera wood pasture hypothesis. And human management creates plagioclimax communities that may arrest or interrupt succession, but they can still be very valuable and functional ecosystems. Thanks for watching, and until next time, happy learning.